Michael Jackson did something surprising that left the world speechless. Imagine a humble orphanage in a remote neighborhood of Los Angeles, where children lived with so little, but still carried the hope of a better future in their eyes. It was a night like any other. The lights were dimmed, the children's laughter began to diminish as the day drew to a close, and the staff wrapped up their tasks, thinking about the challenges they would face the next day. Then, suddenly, something extraordinary happened. Without warning, Michael Jackson, music's biggest star, appeared at the gates. He wasn't surrounded by excessive security guards, nor was there the hustle and bustle of photographers or fans. It was just him, dressed simply, with a look that conveyed calm and a greater purpose. The staff were paralyzed, incredulous at what they were seeing. "Is that really him?" they whispered to each other, not knowing what to expect. Michael Jackson, the man who filled stadiums around the world, had chosen this small orphanage to visit that night. But what was most impressive? He wasn't just there for a brief visit. He had plans that no one could have imagined. Why had he chosen that place? What motivated him to show up unannounced? And what did he do that night that would forever mark the lives of all the children and staff who were there? These are the questions you'll discover throughout this story, but be prepared, every detail is more exciting than the next. Before I continue, I want to know your opinion. Why do you think Michael Jackson chose that orphanage? Was he just curious, or did he have a greater purpose? Write in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this. Now imagine the place where all this happened. A small orphanage located on the outskirts of Los Angeles, where the daily struggle was to ensure that the children had a roof over their heads, meals, and a little hope. The walls were worn down by time, the beds were simple, and there were few toys lying around, most of them already well used. Even so, the place was more than a shelter. It was a home for dozens of children who, despite the difficulties, found the strength to dream in the affection of the staff and in each other's smiles. The director of the orphanage, Mrs. Carter, was a woman with a huge heart, but she faced enormous challenges. Donations were becoming increasingly scarce, and she could barely pay the basic bills. Even so, Mrs. Carter did everything she could to hide this concern from the children. For them, the orphanage was a refuge, a place where they could feel safe, even if the future was uncertain. That evening, she was finalizing the financial records and thinking about how to ask for help when something incredible happened. An unexpected visit was about to change everything. Meanwhile, the children were already in their rooms, talking and laughing before bed. Many of them had experienced stories of abandonment and unimaginable hardship, but there they found a little joy in the simple things: a game in the courtyard, a shared meal, or the promise of a better day. None of them could have imagined that night, something magical was about to happen. The sound of a car pulling up discreetly at the entrance to the orphanage caught Mrs. Carter's attention. When she went to the door, she couldn't believe her eyes. Michael Jackson, music's greatest star, was standing there, looking at the building with a gentle smile. He carried with him something that was hard to describe, a unique presence, a mixture of humility and grandeur at the same time. Mrs. Carter, not knowing what to say, stood completely still as Michael took the first step to enter that place and transform lives forever. Michael Jackson wasn't just the biggest star in music, he was a cultural force, a symbol that transcended generations. That night, however, he wasn't in a packed stadium or surrounded by floodlights. He was just a man, with a humble look and a clear intention, to do something special for a group of children who needed hope. Upon entering the orphanage, Michael was greeted by Mrs. Carter, still incredulous and speechless. He greeted her with a gentle smile, almost as if asking permission to be there. "Good evening, I'm Michael," he said, as if it were necessary to introduce himself. Michael was known for his eccentricities, but also for his empathy. He had always carried with him a unique sensitivity, something that came from his own difficult childhood. Growing up in the spotlight, he knew all too well the loneliness, pressure, and weight of a future that often seemed to be decided by other people. Perhaps that's why he had such a deep connection with children, especially those facing difficulties. He knew what it was like to dream of something better, even when the world seemed against you. That evening, he wanted to do more than just visit the orphanage. He wanted to meet the children, hear their stories, and somehow show them that they were not alone. "I've heard about the incredible work you do here," he told Mrs. Carter, as he looked around the modest space. "I wanted to see for myself and spend some time with these children." His tone was calm, but there was a conviction in his words that was impossible to ignore. Michael wasn't there to be a star. He was there to be human. The children began to appear shyly, pulled by curiosity. Some didn't even know who he was, but his positive energy filled the room. He bent down to greet a little girl holding a worn teddy bear and said, "You have an amazing friend there. What's his name?" The girl laughed and replied, and so began an evening that no one would ever forget. When Michael Jackson entered the orphanage, the atmosphere seemed to freeze in time. His mere presence was like a ray of light in the darkness. Mrs. Carter, still trying to process what was happening, finally asked in a shaky voice, "Mr. Jackson, what brings you here tonight?" He smiled in his characteristic way and replied, "Please call me Michael. I heard about the incredible work you do here, and I wanted to come and meet you in person. I hope I'm not in the way." The humility in his words baffled Mrs. Carter, who would never have imagined such a simple response from someone so great. As Michael walked through the small entrance hall, the children began to realize that there was a stranger there. At first, they were shy, hiding behind the doors and walls, peeking curiously. But soon Michael's warm energy drew them in. He made a point of smiling at each of them, stooping down to their level to chat. "Hi, what's your name?" he asked a little boy who was holding a worn-out socker. "Jake," the boy replied, with a mixture of shyness and curiosity. Michael then took the ball and said, "This ball's had a lot of adventures, huh? Will you teach me how to play later?" Jake smiled for the first time, feeling special. Despite Michael's receptiveness, the situation worried Mrs. Carter. She knew that the orphanage was not in its best shape. The walls needed painting, the furniture was old, and the food stock was at its limit. For her, having someone like Michael Jackson there was an honor, but also a responsibility. "I just hope he won't be disappointed with what he finds here," she thought, as she tried to mentally organize what she could show and what she should hide. Michael noticed the tension on Mrs. Carter's face and said calmly, "Please don't worry, I just want to be here, listen to you and get to know the children. I haven't come to judge, I've come to help." These words eased Mrs. Carter's anxiety a little, but she still didn't know what to expect on such an unusual night. Little did she know that Michael's gesture had only just begun. The evening seemed to be proceeding like a simple visit. Michael Jackson was enchanted by the children, talking to them and learning their stories. He listened attentively to every word, laughing at some and being moved by others. As he walked around the orphanage, he noticed the details, the walls in need of repair, the old toys, the simplicity of the place. But what struck him most was the sparkle in the children's eyes. Despite everything, they had hope. It was something he knew well, having once been a child who dreamed of something bigger in the midst of difficulties. Mrs. Carter was surprised at how much time Michael was devoting to each child. She thought he would stay for an hour at most, take a few photos and leave, as celebrities usually do. But he seemed really immersed in that world. As the evening progressed, Mrs. Carter politely asked, "Michael, it's getting late. Can we prepare something for you before you go?" It was then that he did something completely unexpected. He looked at her with a reassuring smile and replied, "Actually, if it's no trouble, I'd like to spend the night here." Mrs. Carter was stunned for a few seconds. "Sleep here?" she asked, thinking she hadn't understood correctly. Michael confirmed with the same serenity, "Yes. I want to live this experience with the children, to understand what their routine is like. Don't worry, I don't want to cause any problems." The security team at the entrance immediately became agitated. One of them approached and whispered, "Sir, this isn't safe." We can't guarantee your protection here. But Michael, with a firm look on his face, replied, These children live here every day. If it's safe for them, it's safe for me. Despite her initial hesitation, Mrs. Carter eventually agreed. If that's what you want, we'll do our best to make you feel comfortable, she said, although she was still nervous about the idea. When the children heard the news, they were elated. Some started pulling him to show him their rooms and toys, while others just wanted to be close to him, as if they felt he was someone who understood them. And at that moment, the orphanage seemed more alive than ever. For those children, it wasn't just a visit, it was a magical moment that would remain etched in their memories forever. As the lights in the orphanage went out one by one, Michael Jackson was there, sitting on the floor with the children, telling stories, listening to laughter and connecting in a way that few people can. And so he turned what would have been an ordinary evening into something extraordinary, not just for the children, but for everyone who was there. With Michael Jackson's decision to spend the night at the orphanage, the atmosphere was completely transformed. The children, who were initially shy, now couldn't contain their joy. It was as if his presence had ignited something special in each of their hearts. Michael sat on the floor with the children, talking about their dreams and listening attentively to their stories. A little boy called Tommy, who was more reserved, approached slowly. "What do you want to be when you grow up, Tommy?" asked Michael, with a gentle smile. The boy hesitated, but finally answered, "I want to be a singer, like you." Michael held the boy's hands and said, "Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't. It all starts with a dream. It all starts with a dream." Meanwhile, the staff watched the scene with emotion. Mrs. Carter, who had always struggled to keep the orphanage running, saw something that touched her deeply. Michael was there not as a celebrity, but as someone who really cared. He was not only listening, but also inspiring. It was as if, for a few hours, the world outside the walls of the orphanage ceased to exist, and everyone came together in a moment of pure humanity. Later, Michael asked permission to visit the children's rooms. With a flashlight in hand, he went through each bunk, making sure to pay attention to each one. A little girl called Emily tugged on his arm and whispered, "Can you sing us a song?" Michael smiled and began to softly sing an acoustic version of "Heal the World." The children's voices soon joined his, filling the room with such pure harmony that even the staff had to hold back tears. In the kitchen, Michael made a point of helping with the preparation of an evening snack. He asked the children what they would like to eat and helped serve cookies and milk to everyone. It was a simple but extraordinary moment. The children laughed and played, and for a few hours, the weight of their realities seemed to disappear. For them, this wasn't just a global star. He was someone who saw them, who valued them, and who was willing to share some of his light with them. As the evening progressed, Michael found a moment to talk to Mrs. Carter. He asked about the needs of the orphanage, the daily challenges, and how he could help. She explained about the financial difficulties and the dreams she had for the children, such as offering music and art lessons. Michael listened attentively to every word, nodding and asking questions. And although he still hadn't said anything specific, Mrs. Carter began to realize that something bigger was being planned. As the evening progressed and the orphanage filled with an almost magical energy, Michael Jackson found himself reflecting on his own journey. Sitting on a chair in the dining hall, while watching the children play, he began to talk to Mrs. Carter about something that few knew. "I see a lot of myself in these children," he said, with a faraway look in his eyes. "When I was little, I spent so much time trying to be perfect for the world that I often felt lost." Mrs. Carter, surprised by Michael's vulnerability, asked, "And what helped you to keep going?" He replied after a brief pause, "The music, and the hope that I could use what I've achieved to do something meaningful." This conversation led Mrs. Carter to share a little about her own struggle. She explained how she started working at the orphanage because she believed that every child, no matter their background, deserved a chance to dream big. But financial difficulties were making this harder and harder. "Sometimes I feel like we're just surviving," she confessed. Michael listened intently, his expression serious. "Survival is important," he said, "but I believe that these children deserve more than that. They deserve to live, to dream, to create a future." As they talked, memories of his own childhood came flooding back to Michael. He recalled the pressure of endless rehearsals, the weight of early fame, and how, even surrounded by crowds, he felt profoundly alone. "These kids have something I never had," he said, looking at the group of little ones who were now gathered around a lantern, laughing and sharing stories. "They have each other. And that's a powerful thing." But there was an inner conflict that Michael couldn't ignore. He knew that his help could transform the orphanage, but he also felt that no material gesture could replace the love and security that the children needed on a daily basis. He wanted to do more than donate money. He wanted to ensure that these children had something lasting. "If I just sign a check and walk away, will that really make a difference?" he asked himself. It was at that moment that an idea began to form in his mind, something he knew would change everything. As the conversation continued, Mrs. Carter realized that Michael wasn't just a visitor. He was emotionally invested, and his words came from a place of sincerity and experience. She knew that something important was about to happen, but she couldn't imagine what he was planning. And that night, as the orphanage began to hush with the children's sleep, Michael Jackson was still awake, thinking about how to turn that moment into a legacy that would last forever. As the sun began to rise, illuminating the small orphanage, Michael Jackson had already made a decision that would change everything. After spending the night reflecting on the children's stories, Mrs. Carter's difficulties and his own experiences, he knew he couldn't just walk away and leave everything as it was. Before leaving, he gathered Mrs. Carter and the staff in the cafeteria. The children, still sleepy, also approached, curious about what was going on. Michael stood up with a smile on his face and began to speak. "Tonight was special for me. You have given me something I never had in my childhood, a sense of family, of togetherness," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. He looked at the children, who were attentive, and continued, "I want to make sure you have more than just a place to sleep. I want you to have the chance to fulfill your dreams, to build the future you deserve." Mrs. Carter looked at him in surprise, not fully understanding what he was saying. It was then that Michael explained, "I've decided to make a donation to renovate this orphanage. We're going to renovate this place, create spaces where you can learn music, art, and everything that inspires your dreams. And that's just the beginning." He paused, letting his words sink in, and added, "I also want to set up a fund to ensure that no child here has to worry about education or basic needs. You deserve the best." For a moment, there was silence in the hall. Michael's words seemed surreal. Mrs. Carter, visibly moved, put her hand to her chest and said, "Michael, this is more than we could ever dream of. Thank you, on behalf of all these children." The children, even though they didn't fully understand the magnitude of what was happening, began to applaud and smile. For them, what mattered was that Michael had believed in them, that he was there, present, and that he cared. Before leaving, Michael made a point of talking to each child individually, encouraging them never to give up on their dreams. He also asked Mrs. Carter to stay in touch, making sure she had the support she needed to implement the changes. "This isn't just a donation," he said. "I want to follow every step of the way. I want to see this place flourish." And with that, he said goodbye, leaving behind not just promises, but renewed hope and a commitment to transform the future. Months have passed since that magical night, and the little orphanage has never been the same. What were once worn walls were now renovated spaces, full of color and life. New rooms were built, a music room, equipped with instruments donated especially for the children, and an art studio where they could express their emotions in ways they had never imagined. All of this had been made possible thanks to Michael Jackson's promise, which not only came true, but exceeded all expectations. The children, who had previously faced uncertainty, were now enrolled in good schools thanks to the educational fund Michael had set up. Mrs. Carter, who had been carrying the weight of the orphanage alone, now had the financial and structural support she needed to offer more than the basics. She described the transformation as a modern miracle. "Michael didn't just give us resources," she said in an interview. "He gave us a future. He believed in us when we didn't even know if we could go on." But the impact of Michael's gesture went far beyond renovations and financial support. His story has inspired people all over the world. Other donors, moved by the star's example, began contributing to the orphanage and other similar institutions. The small community around the orphanage also got involved, offering their time and skills to help in any way they could. What began as an unexpected evening became a movement of hope and solidarity. And what about the children? Many of them, who had previously only dreamed, now had the chance to turn those dreams into reality. Jake, the boy who wanted to be a singer, started taking music lessons. Emily, who asked Michael to sing that night, was now drawing on large sheets of paper, dreaming of becoming an illustrator. Every smile, every achievement, was a direct reflection of the impact of that unique evening. Mrs. Carter, always emotional when talking about Michael, keeps a note he left before he left. Never underestimate the power of believing in someone. A gesture, no matter how small, can change a person's world. That note is framed in her office as a daily reminder that, even in the most difficult times, there is hope. The legacy of that night when Michael Jackson slept in an orphanage lives on to this day. It wasn't just a visit, nor was it just a donation. It was an act of empathy, which showed that even the world's biggest stars can connect with people in a deeply human way. The story has become a symbol of how small gestures can generate big changes and how believing in someone can transform lives. Michael didn't just renovate a physical place, he rekindled dreams, inspired hope and created a new reality for those children. But this story isn't just about Michael. It's about the power of belief, about how each of us, within our means, can do something meaningful. We may not be able to renovate an orphanage or create an educational fund, but we can offer our time, our listening, and our care to those in need. What about you? What would you do if you had the chance to transform someone's life? Let this story be a reminder that even the most unexpected moments can carry the opportunity to make a difference. Think about how you can impact the life of someone around you. Sometimes, all a person needs is a gesture of kindness and attention to rekindle the flame of hope. Do you believe in the power of these small gestures? Before closing, we want to know what you think. If you had the opportunity to do something as great as Michael did, what would you do? Share it in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more of this star's inspiring and moving stories. See you in the next video.